The second bullet tore through his left shoulder. Conrad Ashford ground his teeth, one hand clamped over the wound, the other gripping the steering wheel. The Maybach tore through the Vegas night like a wounded beast. Behind him, the headlights of his pursuers were closing the distance. He knew he was about to die. He just didn't know that his life would be saved by an 8-year-old boy who was still awake late into the night, waiting for his aunt to come home. And that boy had no idea that the man he was about to save was the very one who would soon destroy the only roof he had ever known. Conrad slammed his foot on the gas, and the car shrieked across the pavement as it shot through an empty intersection. Blood from his left shoulder ran down his arm, soaking into the sleeve of his suit jacket, dripping onto the cream-colored leather seat. His vision had begun to blur, the streetlights melting together into long, endless streaks of light. In the rearview mirror, the 2 black SUVs were still chasing him, their headlights like the eyes of predators tearing through the darkness. Conrad jerked the wheel to the right without warning. The tires skidded across the asphalt. The Maybach swerved wildly, then caught itself again. He left the main boulevard and plunged into the narrow streets on the east side of the city, where the neon lights didn't reach, where Vegas revealed its true face. Rows of aging apartment buildings rose on either side of the road, their brick walls stained and weathered, their windows either blacked out or glowing with only the faintest trace of light. Conrad fought to keep his eyes open, but his body was betraying him. Every heartbeat pumped more blood out through the wound. Every passing second stole another piece of his awareness. His hand trembled on the wheel. His fingers were going numb, no longer able to feel the cool surface of the leather beneath them. The car turned into the final alley, where the darkness was thick as ink, where there was no way out. Conrad saw the brick wall looming in front of him, but his foot no longer had the strength to hit the brake. The Maybach slammed straight into the wall. The sound of twisting metal cracked through the night, then died away. The engine groaned one last time and fell silent. Somewhere in the distance, the sirens of the pursuit echoed for a moment, then faded, farther and farther away, swallowed by the maze of intersecting streets. They had lost him, at least for now. Conrad collapsed against the steering wheel, his forehead striking the leather as blood kept seeping through the fingers clutched desperately over his left shoulder. His consciousness slipped away like sand running through an open hand. Before the darkness swallowed him completely, he saw something above him. The soft yellow glow from a second-floor window in the old apartment building, warm and gentle in the middle of the cold night. That light was the last thing Conrad saw before his eyes closed. The darkness swallowed everything. Only the creaking sound of a ceiling fan from the apartment above drifted down into the silent alley. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support us. Don't forget to share this video with the people you love. And if you'd like to follow the stories still to come, please subscribe to the channel now. The second-floor apartment sat in stillness beneath the pale yellow glow of a table lamp. Mason Mercer sat curled up on a worn fabric sofa, his small back resting against the armrest, a pad of drawing paper lying across his lap. The 8-year-old boy held an orange-colored pencil and slowly shaded the unfinished picture before him. The house in the drawing had wide windows, with golden light spilling outward, with a white fence and green trees in the yard. Things this small apartment did not have. The wall clock struck 11, and the second hand kept moving in its steady circle while Mason went on waiting. Aunt Jolene still hadn't come home. Her night shifts at the hospital often stretched on like this, sometimes until midnight, sometimes even later. Mason was used to sitting alone in this apartment, used to the ceiling fan creaking overhead, used to the darkness slipping into the corners the lamp couldn't reach. The boy wasn't afraid of the dark, he just didn't like the silence. A violent crash shattered the night. Mason flinched, and the pencil slipped from his hand, rolling across the floor. The sound had come from the alley below, metal slamming against brick, glass breaking, then sudden silence. He jumped off the sofa and ran to the window, both hands gripping the old wooden frame. Below him, the alley, black as ink, had been torn open by the dim flicker of headlights. A gleaming black car lay crumpled against the wall at the end of the alley, white smoke rising from the hood, while the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber drifted upward on the night air all the way to the window. The headlights blinked a few times, then died completely, leaving the alley buried in darkness once more. Mason waited. He stared down at the car, waiting for a door to open, waiting for someone to step out. 1 minute passed. Nothing. 2 minutes. Still no movement from inside the car. Mason bit his lip, his heart beating hard inside his chest. Aunt Jolene always told him never to open the door for strangers, never to go outside after dark, never to do anything dangerous when she wasn't home. But she had also once said something else. On a night when he had asked why she worked so hard at the hospital, she had told him that if he ever saw someone in need of help, he should at least try to do something, even if it was only calling for someone to come. Mason looked down at the motionless car once again. Someone was in there. Someone might need help. The boy ran to the table and grabbed the old phone his aunt had left for him in case of emergencies. Then he opened the apartment door, raced down the dark stairwell, his small footsteps echoing across the creaking wooden steps. The back door of the building swung open, and Mason stepped into the alley, where the smell of gasoline struck him hard. He moved toward the car, his heart pounding, his hand gripping the phone. The driver's door had come slightly ajar from the force of the crash. Mason pulled with both hands, and the heavy door opened with a groaning squeal. The man slumped over the steering wheel, sagged toward him. Mason stepped back once, his eyes wide. The man's face was pale as paper, the weak alley light falling across sharp features that were draining away with life. Blood had soaked through the shoulder of his black suit jacket, running down his arm, dripping onto the leather seat. Mason didn't scream. The boy didn't run. He stood there, staring at the blood, at the stranger's face, at the eyes slowly opening. The man's eyes were clouded, and he looked at Mason as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His lips moved, trying to say something, but only a ragged breath came out. Mason looked once more at the blood, then back at the face that was steadily losing its color. He opened the phone and dialed Aunt Jolene. The call rang twice, then her voice came through on the other end. Mason spoke quickly, his voice trembling just slightly, but not with panic. "Auntie, someone is badly hurt, in the alley behind our building. There's so much blood. I think he's been shot." Jolene's voice changed at once, from exhausted to sharp and alert. "Mason, listen to me. I'm coming right now. 15 minutes. Don't touch the wound. Try to keep him awake. Can you do that?" Mason nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. "Yes, ma'am." The call ended. The boy dropped to his knees beside the open car door, his knees touching the cold ground of the alley. He looked into the man's eyes, trying to keep his gaze fixed on him. "My aunt will be here soon. She's a nurse. She knows how to save people." Conrad looked at the child in front of him, at those wide green eyes that held not a trace of fear, only sincere concern, something he hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for many years. No fear, no calculation, no desire to get anything from him. Conrad wanted to tell the boy to leave, that this was dangerous, that the men hunting him could come back at any moment. But he no longer had the strength. His lips only moved without meaning. Mason took hold of his wrist, that small hand startlingly warm against the cold of the night. "You have to keep breathing. My aunt says that's the most important thing. Do you hear me? Just keep breathing. My aunt will come." The shriek of tires scraping across the pavement shattered the stillness of the alley. Headlights swept across the brick wall, across the crumpled Maybach, across the small figure of Mason kneeling beside the open car door. An old gray sedan jerked to a stop, and the door flew open before the engine had even fully died. Jolene Mercer jumped out, still wearing her white nursing shoes, still dressed in the pale blue scrubs from a shift she hadn't even had time to change out of. Her chestnut brown hair had been hastily tied at the nape of her neck, a few loose strands falling across her forehead. Her face was tight with strain beneath the weak alley light as she ran toward Mason and the wounded stranger. Jolene dropped to her knees beside Conrad, her gray-blue eyes sweeping quickly from head to toe. It was the gaze of someone familiar with blood, with emergency rooms, with life-and-death moments inside intensive care units. Wound to the left shoulder, severe blood loss, skin pale, pulse weak but still there. She recognized the bullet hole at once when she saw the way the blood had soaked through the suit fabric. This wasn't an ordinary car accident. Her eyes flicked over the gleaming silver watch on his wrist, the finely tailored black suit now drenched in blood, the polished leather shoes. This man didn't belong in this neighborhood, and his wound told her he was tangled in something dangerous. Jolene didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask why he'd been shot. There wasn't time for those questions. She turned to Mason, her voice quick and firm. "Help me on this side. We're taking him inside." Mason nodded, without questions, without hesitation. The boy slipped an arm beneath Conrad's uninjured side, trying with all his small strength to support part of the weight. Jolene braced the other side, her shoulder taking most of the burden of the tall man who was nearly unconscious. The three of them moved slowly through the back entrance of the building and up the dark stairwell. Conrad was barely aware of anything now, his feet dragging over each creaking wooden step. Blood dripped from his shoulder onto the floor, leaving a dark red trail on every stair they climbed. The small apartment opened to receive them. Jolene brought Conrad to the kitchen corner, the only place with enough light from the fluorescent bulb overhead. She lowered him onto the cold tile floor and slipped a sofa pillow beneath his head. Then she rose, opened the kitchen cabinet, and pulled out the large first aid kit she had brought home from the hospital. Inside was everything an emergency room nurse would need for moments like this. Jolene knelt beside Conrad and took scissors to the seam of his expensive suit jacket, then to the white shirt beneath it. The fabric split apart, revealing the blood-soaked wound in his shoulder. The bullet was still inside. Her hands worked quickly and precisely, without trembling, without hesitation. She cleaned the blood from around the wound, disinfected it, and laid out her instruments. Mason stood beside her, handing over each thing she needed, like a little assistant who already knew the work. Gauze, bandages, forceps, needle and thread. The boy didn't ask questions. He simply watched and moved when needed. Conrad lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. Through the blurred haze of pain and exhaustion, he took in the apartment around him, tiny, smaller than the bathroom in his penthouse. The furniture was old but clean, arranged neatly inside the cramped space. There was no air conditioning, only an old ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, its steady creaking like the beat of a tired heart. On the kitchen wall, children's drawings had been taped up, their bright colors standing out against pale yellow paint that had long since faded. The air carried the faint scent of cheap soap and cold coffee. This world was nothing like anything Conrad knew. No marble, no million-dollar art, no cold luxury, only simplicity, warmth, and poverty. Jolene focused on the wound and carefully removed the bullet. By some mercy, it hadn't struck bone, hadn't torn through a major artery. He would live, as long as infection didn't set in. She began stitching the wound, the needle piercing skin, the medical thread drawing the torn flesh back together. Conrad ground his teeth, sweat breaking across his forehead, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out. But he didn't make a sound. No groan, no cry, no shout. Jolene noticed that. This man was used to pain, used to violence. This wasn't the first time he'd been hurt. Mason stood nearby, his eyes fixed on the wound being sewn shut, his little voice soft. "Is he going to make it, Auntie?" Jolene didn't look up. Her hands kept working. "If he stays still and listens to me, he'll be fine." Conrad's lips moved as he tried to say something. Maybe thank you. Maybe a question. Jolene cut him off, and her voice was no longer gentle. "Don't say a word. Rest. Morning can deal with the rest." Conrad no longer had the strength to argue. He let his consciousness sink once more into darkness, his breathing slowly evening out, his body surrendering to the cold kitchen floor. Jolene tied off the final stitch, cut the thread, and bandaged the wound with care. Then she lowered herself into an old kitchen chair, leaned her back against the wall, and let out a tired breath. She looked at the stranger lying on the floor of her home. His expensive black suit had been cut to pieces and tossed aside, his silver watch still glinting beneath the kitchen light, his bullet wound neatly wrapped. Jolene understood exactly what she had just done. She had pulled something very dangerous into her small apartment. This man wasn't some ordinary businessman caught in bad luck. The bullet wound, the way he endured pain, the luxury car in a dark alley, he was the kind of thing Jolene had spent her whole life trying to stay far away from. But she didn't regret it. She had done what needed to be done. She was a nurse. She saved people. That was all she knew how to do. Mason sat down beside his aunt, his eyes drooping with sleep, though he still fought to stay awake. Jolene pulled the boy into her arms and kissed the top of his head. "Go to sleep now, sweetheart. I'll watch over him. Tomorrow, everything will be all right." Vegas sunlight streamed through the dust-coated window, and a pale golden band stretched across the old tile floor. Conrad opened his eyes, and an unfamiliar ceiling came hazily into view. The ceiling was stained with damp patches, the paint peeling away in small flakes, while an old ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. It took him a few seconds to remember where he was. The dark alley, the gunshots, the car slamming into the wall, the child with the green eyes, the woman in nurse's scrubs. Then the sharp pain in his left shoulder pulled him fully back into the present, reminding him that none of it had been a dream. Conrad realized he was no longer lying on the cold kitchen floor. Someone had moved him onto an old, worn sofa. A thin blanket had been draped over him, and an old pillow had been tucked beneath his head. He looked around the apartment in the daylight. It was even smaller than he had thought. 4 yellowed walls boxed in the cramped little space, with only a few belongings, all arranged with care. The soft sound of a television came from the corner of the room, where a cartoon was playing in bright, cheerful colors. Mason sat on the floor in front of it, his back turned to Conrad, his head tilted slightly as he watched the show. The boy turned around as if he had felt the weight of someone looking at him. His eyes lit up when he saw Conrad awake. "Auntie, he's awake." Footsteps sounded from the small bedroom in the back. Jolene stepped out, dark circles beneath her eyes from staying up through the night to watch over a stranger. She had changed into simple clothes, her brown hair falling loose over her shoulders, and there was no expression on her face when she looked toward Conrad. Conrad tried to sit up, bracing a hand against the sofa cushion. The pain in his left shoulder made him wince, and his breath came fast and rough. Jolene crossed the room quickly and placed a hand on his uninjured shoulder, pushing him back down with gentle firmness. "Lie down. The stitches aren't stable yet. If you move too much, they'll tear open." Conrad looked at her, his voice rough from dryness. "Where's my phone?" Jolene let go of him and straightened. "It's destroyed. Thrown out of the car when you hit the wall. I found it in the alley this morning, shattered into pieces." Conrad closed his eyes for a second, trying to contain his impatience. "I need to contact my people, right now. Is there another phone?" Jolene folded her arms across her chest and studied him with a searching look. "Contact who? The people who shot you, or someone else?" Conrad looked at Jolene, really looked at the woman who had saved his life for the first time. Her face was tired, with shadows beneath her eyes, but there was nothing weak about her. Her gray eyes with that faint trace of blue looked directly at him, without flinching, without fear. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he was capable of. And yet she stood there looking at him as though he were nothing more than an ordinary patient being difficult. That was rare. In Conrad's world, everyone feared him, or pretended not to fear him, so they could win his favor. No one looked at him with the kind of indifference and faint exhaustion this woman carried in her eyes. "Do you know who I am?" Jolene tilted her head a little, as though the question itself were strange. "No. And to be honest, I don't want to know. I only know you were shot. I know you can't go to a hospital for some reason. I know you're the kind of man people want dead. That's already more than enough." Conrad asked again, his voice slow and measured. "Then why did you still save me? If you knew I was dangerous, why bring me into your home?" Jolene glanced toward Mason, who was listening closely to every word, then looked back at Conrad. "Because that boy found you. He called me. And I don't teach him to leave a dying person in front of him and walk away, no matter who that person is." Conrad fell silent for a moment, taking in her answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and unhurried. "I'll compensate you. Money, or whatever you need. Just say it." Jolene didn't answer right away. She looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, as if weighing how serious he really was. Then she shook her head. "I'm not taking your money." Conrad lifted an eyebrow slightly. "Everybody needs money. Just look around this apartment." Jolene's gaze turned a little colder. "I'm not everybody, and I don't want anything to do with your world. Your money is almost certainly dirty, and I don't need more trouble in my life." Conrad looked at her, and something strange stirred inside him. This woman didn't want his money, didn't want a favor, didn't want anything at all. She had saved him because of a simple principle, without calculation, without expecting anything in return. In Conrad's world, that almost didn't exist. Everything had a price. Everyone wanted something. He didn't know how to respond to someone who wanted nothing from him. Conrad let out a breath, giving in for the moment. "At least let me stay here one more day, until I can reach someone I trust." Jolene looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the risk. Then she gave a short nod. "One day. After that, you leave. And don't bring your trouble to my door." She turned and walked back into the kitchen without another word. Mason was still sitting there, now turned fully around, staring at Conrad with open, green-eyed curiosity. The boy said nothing. He simply studied the stranger on the sofa, as though trying to understand what kind of man he really was. Conrad lay back down and fixed his gaze on the ceiling, mottled with damp stains. One day. He only needed one day to reach Nina, to put things in order, to find out what was happening beyond these walls. But he didn't know that this one day would stretch far longer than that. And he didn't know that at this very moment, somewhere in the glittering sprawl of Vegas, someone was tearing through every street looking for him, trying to finish what they had begun the night before. The penthouse at the top of Ashford Holdings Tower was flooded with golden dawn light. The entire space was wrapped in glass and steel, looking down over the city of Vegas, still heavy with sleep below. Pierce Lawson stood before the enormous wall of glass, a phone in his hand. The call on it just ended. The sunrise painted the high-rise buildings in the distance with gold, but his face was cold as stone. Pierce turned and looked around the penthouse surrounding him. Expensive furniture, works of art hanging on the walls, a collection of rare liquor displayed behind glass. All of it belonged to Conrad Ashford. But now Conrad was dead. Or at least, Pierce wanted to believe that. Pierce dialed a number and lifted the phone to his ear. The voice of one of his men came through immediately. Pierce asked in a clipped tone. "Where was the car found?" "In the eastern outskirts, sir. In an alley behind a row of old apartment buildings. The car's badly damaged, and there's blood on the driver's seat. But no body." Pierce ground his teeth, his jaw tightening hard. No body means he's still alive. Find him. Tear apart every alley. Knock on every door if you have to. I want to know where he is before the sun goes down. The call ended. Pierce slipped the phone into the pocket of his suit jacket and stared out over the city below. 10 years. 10 years standing in Conrad's shadow, doing every filthy task, enduring every slight. Now the opportunity had come. He wasn't going to let Conrad survive and take back what Pierce had waited far too long to claim. The penthouse door opened, and Nina Tran stepped inside. 29 years old, expressionless, dressed in neat business clothes. She had been Conrad's personal assistant for the past 5 years, one of the very few people Conrad trusted even somewhat. Pierce turned toward her and smiled, though the smile never reached his eyes. "Nina, any news about Conrad yet?" Nina stopped in the middle of the room, her eyes never blinking. "Nothing yet, sir. His phone can't be reached. No one knows where he is." Pierce moved closer, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "If there's any news at all, no matter how small, report to me first, not to anyone else. While Conrad is absent, I'm in charge of everything here." Nina nodded, her face still unreadable. "I understand, sir." She turned and walked out. But when the door closed behind her, her eyes were colder than Pierce had imagined. She didn't trust him for a single second, and she would find a way to reach Conrad, even if she had to turn the whole city upside down. That afternoon, in the small apartment in the eastern outskirts, Conrad sat on the sofa, his shoulder bandaged, his eyes fixed on the window. Jolene had gone to work an afternoon shift at the hospital, leaving Mason at home to keep watch over the stranger she had saved. No phone, no way to make contact, no idea who out there was still loyal. It was the first time in 15 years that Conrad Ashford was completely out of control. He had built the Ashford Syndicate with his bare hands. He had walked through countless enemies. He had held half the city of Vegas in his grasp. But now he sat here, in a cramped apartment, wounded, unarmed, and utterly powerless. 3 knocks hit the door, hard and decisive. Not the polite knock of a neighbor. Conrad rose at once, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He motioned to Mason, his voice low and quick. "Hide behind the refrigerator. Don't come out no matter what happens. Do you understand?" Mason nodded, his eyes wide but not panicked. The boy ran into the kitchen and tucked himself behind the old refrigerator. Conrad moved toward the door, empty-handed, shoulder throbbing, but his back still straight. The door was kicked open before he could reach it. Wood split apart, the hinges burst loose, and the door slammed against the wall with a crash. 2 large men stepped inside, faces cold, eyes sweeping quickly over the apartment. One of them laughed when he saw Conrad standing there, shoulder bandaged, face pale. "There he is. Pierce is going to pay well for this one." The other man looked around the tiny apartment and gave a contemptuous snort. The head of the Ashford Syndicate hiding in a dump like this? That's pathetic. Conrad stood straight, not taking a single step back, even though pain was stabbing through his shoulder. "Pierce sent you?" The bigger man nodded, one hand in his coat pocket as though he were gripping something inside. "He wants to talk to you. Whether you go alive or dead depends on how cooperative you are." Conrad took 1 step forward, his eyes cold as steel. "Go back and tell Pierce that Conrad Ashford doesn't die as easily as he thinks." The other man laughed under his breath, his eyes dropping from the bandage on Conrad's shoulder to his bare feet. "You're wounded, unarmed, hiding in somebody else's broken-down apartment. What exactly are you planning to do? Fight us?" Conrad lowered his voice, deep and slow, each word falling like cold stone. "I built the Ashford Syndicate when you were still running errands in the street. I've buried men far stronger than you. Do you think Pierce can protect you from me? Do you think he's strong enough to keep that chair warm when I come back?" The two men glanced at each other, and the confidence in their eyes wavered. Conrad went on, his voice like a blade drawing slowly across skin. "I will return, and when I do, I will remember every man who stood with Pierce. Do you want your names on that list?" Silence stretched between them. One of the men swallowed hard and looked sideways at the other. Neither wanted to be the first to speak. Conrad stared directly into each of their eyes. "Get out, and tell Pierce I'm coming for him." The two men looked at one another once more, then slowly back toward the door, not because Conrad was stronger than they were in that moment, but because his reputation was enough to make them afraid. The stories of Conrad Ashford, of what he had done to build his empire, of enemies who had vanished without a trace. They didn't want to become the next story. The door shut, and the sound of their footsteps faded down the stairs. Conrad exhaled and leaned against the wall, pain piercing through his shoulder. The adrenaline drained away, leaving his body exhausted and shaking. Mason stepped out from behind the refrigerator, his eyes still wide, but he didn't cry, didn't panic. He looked at Conrad and spoke in a soft voice. "You really are scary." Conrad looked at the child and didn't know what to say. Mason came a little closer, stopping a few steps away. "But you stood in front of the door. You didn't let them come farther inside." "Thank you." Conrad looked at the boy, and something strange rose inside his chest. It had been a very long time since anyone had thanked him for anything. The sound of a car screeching to a stop came from the alley outside, followed by hurried footsteps running up the stairs. Jolene appeared in the shattered doorway, her horrified eyes sweeping quickly across the apartment. She saw the splintered door. She saw Conrad leaning against the wall. She saw Mason standing in the middle of the room. "Mason." She ran to him and pulled him into her arms, checking him from head to toe. "Are you all right? Did anyone hurt you?" Mason shook his head. "I'm okay, Auntie. He protected me." Jolene lifted her eyes to Conrad, and her relief quickly turned into anger. "I told you not to bring your trouble here." Conrad nodded, offering no excuse. "They'll come back. You and the boy aren't safe while I'm here." Jolene stood up, her eyes blazing. "Then get out right now. Leave my home." Conrad shook his head slowly, his voice dropping lower. "If I leave now, they'll think you know something about me. They'll think you know where I am, where I'm going next. They'll come back and question you, and they won't ask politely." Jolene went still, her face turning pale as the meaning of his words settled into her. She looked at the broken door. She looked at her nephew standing in the middle of the room. She looked at the stranger who had dragged her into his world. Without meaning to, she had bound herself to this dangerous mess, and now she had no idea how to get free. The second day passed inside the small apartment. Conrad was stronger now, and the wound in his shoulder had begun to heal, but he still couldn't leave safely. Pierce's men might be watching outside, and he had no way to contact Nina or anyone else he could trust. He sat on the sofa, his back resting against the worn fabric cushions, watching the daily life of the aunt and nephew unfold before him. Jolene woke at 5 in the morning, while the sky was still not fully light. Conrad heard her moving quietly in the kitchen, heard the soft hiss of a hot skillet, smelled toast and fried eggs spreading through the cramped little space. A simple breakfast was set out on the old kitchen table. Toast, fried eggs, boxed orange juice. Nothing luxurious, but enough. Mason woke on time, dressed himself, packed his school bag without needing a single reminder. The boy moved around the apartment with the ease of someone who had known this routine for a long time, like a small clock keeping perfect time to its own steady rhythm. Jolene and Mason ate breakfast together, exchanging a few short words about homework, about her shift that day, about who would take out the trash. They had a life with its own clear order, smooth and practiced, fitting together like two gears in the same machine. Conrad watched from the sofa and realized they had lived like this for a very long time, just the two of them, taking care of one another, depending on no one else. Jolene put on her nurse's uniform and slung an old handbag over her shoulder. She paused at the door and looked toward Conrad with guarded eyes. "I'm working the morning shift. You are not to leave this apartment, and don't let anyone see you. Understood? Conrad nodded without protest. Jolene turned to Mason, and her voice softened just a little. You stay here and keep an eye on him. If anything happens, call me right away. Mason nodded, his face serious like a little man far older than his years. Yes, ma'am. I understand. The door closed. Jolene's footsteps faded down the creaking wooden stairs, and then were gone. Conrad sat there and watched Mason through the morning. The boy settled at the little table in the corner of the room and took out his schoolbooks to do his work. No one reminded him. No one checked on him. He simply worked through each assignment on his own, his slanted handwriting moving steadily across the page. At noon, Mason went into the kitchen by himself, opened the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of milk, and made a simple sandwich. He ate alone in front of the television, but he didn't sit there watching cartoons all day the way Conrad had expected. Only for a little while. Then he turned it off and went back to his work. No complaints, no demand, none of the sulking fits of childhood. Conrad noticed something then. This child had grown up too soon, not because he wanted to, but because life had required it of him, just as it once had with Conrad himself, when he had been a very different boy. In the afternoon, Mason brought Conrad a glass of water, then sat down on the floor beside the sofa, his back resting against it. He was quiet for a little while, then asked, in the calm tone of someone asking about the weather, "Do you have a family?" Conrad looked at him, slightly surprised by the directness of the question. "No." Mason nodded, as though that answer made perfect sense. "I don't either. Just Aunt Jolene." He said it like the simplest truth in the world, not sad, not self-pitying, just fact. Conrad didn't ask anything else, but the curiosity showed on his face. Mason went on by himself, his tone still calm. "My dad died when I was really little. I don't remember his face, and my mom left after the funeral. She said she couldn't handle it anymore. Aunt Jolene has been raising me ever since." Conrad was silent. He didn't offer hollow comforts like your aunt loves you very much or everything will be all right. He simply stayed quiet, because he understood that sometimes silence was the only thing that meant anything. Night came. Jolene returned late, exhausted after a 12-hour shift. She sat down at the kitchen table, one hand rubbing her forehead, her eyes closed. Deep lines of weariness marked her face in ways a woman of 27 never should have carried. Conrad watched from the sofa, then stood, crossed to the table, and lowered himself into the chair across from her. Jolene opened her eyes and looked at him, but said nothing. Conrad spoke first, his voice low. "Do you work this much every day?" Jolene let out a tired breath. "Bills don't pay themselves. And Vegas isn't paradise the way people think. At least not for people like me." Conrad looked at her, then around the small apartment, then at the children's drawings taped to the wall. "You saved my life. At least tell me why you did it." Jolene was quiet for a long time, as if deciding whether she wanted to answer at all. Then she began, her voice steady but heavy. 8 years ago, a car accident on the highway, about 300 miles south of here. My whole family was in that car. Conrad looked at the faint scar on her wrist and understood that it had come from that night. Jolene went on, her eyes fixed somewhere far away. "My father, my mother, my little brother. I was the only one still breathing when the ambulance got there. The doctor said I was lucky. I didn't think so. What kind of luck is it to survive and lose everything?" Her voice didn't break, but every word seemed to carry the full weight of 8 years of pain. "Mason's mother left right after the funeral, said she couldn't handle it. I dropped out of school, took him in, and I've worked ever since. I became a mother at 19. No one taught me how to do that." Conrad listened without interrupting, without offering empty words of comfort. He simply listened. It was something he rarely did for anyone. Jolene looked straight into his eyes. "You asked why I saved you. Because I know what it feels like when no one comes to save you. I lay in twisted metal for 20 minutes, hearing my father's breathing grow weaker and weaker until it stopped right beside me. I couldn't do anything. No one got there in time." She stopped and drew in a deep breath. "I don't want anyone to go through that. Not even someone like you." Silence stretched between them. Conrad looked down at the old wooden tabletop, his voice lower now. "I lost my family too, just in a different way." Jolene looked at him, but didn't ask. Conrad continued, almost in a whisper. I destroyed it with my own hands. He didn't explain further. And Jolene didn't demand that he do so. Jolene stood and prepared to go to bed. She paused at the bedroom door and turned back to look at Conrad, still sitting there in the darkness of the kitchen. You owe me, Mr. Ashford, but that's not a debt you repay with money. Conrad looked at her and waited. Jolene went on, her voice slow and measured. You owe me an answer. When this is over, are you going to keep living the way you always have? Or are you going to live differently? She didn't wait for him to reply. She stepped into the bedroom and closed the door softly behind her. Conrad remained there alone in the dark, while the streetlight through the window cast pale bands of light across the floor. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer ready for a question, and that unsettled him in a way no enemy ever had. On the morning of the third day, Vegas sunlight poured through the window as it always did. But Conrad knew he had to leave today. The wound in his shoulder had healed enough that the pain was now only a dull ache instead of the sharp, piercing agony of those first days. He could move his arm without wincing, could walk normally without leaning against the wall for support. Jolene had left for an early shift while the sky was still dim, and only Mason remained at home with him. Conrad stood in the middle of the small living room, checking his shoulder one more time, testing the rotation of his arm, flexing and straightening his fingers. He had stayed here long enough. It was time to return to his own world, to face Pierce, to take back what belonged to him. The sound of small, hurried footsteps came from behind him. Wait a second. Conrad turned and saw Mason running toward him, a sheet of drawing paper clutched in his hand. The boy stopped in front of him, breathing hard from the run across the room, his eyes shining with eager excitement. Mason held the paper up to Conrad with both hands, as though offering him something precious. I drew this for you. You should take it. Conrad took the paper and looked down. It was a drawing done in colored pencil, all childish, uneven lines from the hand of an 8-year-old boy. A small house sat in the center of the page, with a red roof, yellow walls, and windows glowing with light inside, shaded in bright orange. In front of the house stood 3 people side by side, a woman with brown hair wearing blue, a little curly-haired boy standing in the middle, and beside him, a tall man dressed in black. Above the house, Mason had scrawled one word in red pencil: home. Conrad held the page, and his fingers trembled slightly without his understanding why. He stared at the drawing, at the man in black Mason had sketched there. How long had it been since he had appeared in anyone's family picture? How long had it been since anyone had drawn him as part of something called home? His penthouse was filled with paintings worth millions of dollars, but not one of them held him inside it. Only cold canvases, unfamiliar colors, abstract forms that meant nothing beyond money. Mason looked up at him and spoke with simple innocence. I drew you because you've been here for a few days now, like part of the family. Conrad looked at the boy, his voice dropping lower. I'm not your family, Mason. Mason tilted his head, as though considering something very complicated. Then he shook his head. I know, but you were here. You ate with me. You sent the bad men away so they couldn't hurt me. So I drew you in it. What's wrong with that? The child's simple logic left Conrad with no answer. In Mason's world, things were far simpler. You were here, you protected me, so you are family. No blood required, no papers, none of the tangled relationships adults spend their lives inventing. Conrad looked at the drawing once more. The house in it was tiny, crooked, the windows uneven, the roof a little off-center, the clumsy lines of an 8-year-old child who had never learned how to draw properly. But there was warm yellow light inside the windows. There were 3 people standing together in front of the door. There was the word home written above them. This drawing was more beautiful than any grand architectural plan he had ever approved, more beautiful than the multi-million-dollar developments he had built, because it held something those buildings never had: real warmth. Conrad folded the paper carefully, each crease neat and deliberate, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, close against his chest. He didn't know why he did it. He only knew he couldn't leave that drawing behind, couldn't throw it in the trash or forget it on the table. It had to go with him. Conrad stepped toward the door, with Mason following behind him. At the threshold, Conrad stopped and turned for one last look at the small apartment, the worn sofa where he had slept for 3 nights, the little television in the corner of the room, the children's drawings taped to the kitchen wall, the faint smell of cheap coffee and soap drifting through the air. 3 days here had stretched longer than many years in his cold penthouse. 3 days here had taught him more than 15 years spent at the summit of power. Mason stood at the door, looking up at Conrad, his voice soft. "You'll come back, won't you?" Conrad looked at him, looked into those clear green eyes waiting for an answer. He didn't say a word. He only gave a small nod. Then he walked away, down the stairs, out of the old apartment building, and into the alley where his Maybach had slammed into the wall 3 nights before. The drawing in his inner pocket rested against his chest, weightless as nothing more than a sheet of paper, and yet heavier than any multi-million-dollar contract he had ever signed. 2 hours after leaving Jolene's apartment, Conrad sat in an unremarkable black sedan gliding through the outer roads of Vegas. Nina Tran was behind the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road, glancing now and then into the rearview mirror to make sure no one was following them. She had found a way to reach Conrad through a secret number known only to the two of them, then picked him up at a meeting point a few miles north of the apartment complex. The car moved through quiet streets, keeping far from the noisy heart of Vegas, keeping far from the places where Pierce might have eyes and ears waiting. Nina began her report, her voice even, though tension ran beneath it like an underground current. "Pierce has taken control of almost everything. He told the council that you died in the attack, that he would run things temporarily until the situation stabilizes." Conrad listened with no expression on his face, though his jaw tightened. Nina went on. "The council is divided. Some believe Pierce. Some are suspicious but don't dare speak. No one wants to end up on the wrong side." Conrad asked only one short question. "What else?" Nina glanced at him through the rearview mirror, lowering her voice. "The Sunrise Development Project. Pierce has pushed it forward. The final approval meeting will happen in 3 days. If it passes, implementation will begin immediately." Conrad remembered Sunrise Development. He had approved it about 6 months earlier, one of dozens of real estate projects he signed off on every year. A new commercial development on the eastern outskirts of Vegas, with an upscale shopping center and premium office space. He didn't remember the details because Pierce had handled everything, from negotiations to paperwork. Conrad had only signed the final line, the way he had with hundreds of other projects. Nina handed him a thick folder from the seat beside her. "I pulled together everything related to Sunrise. You need to look at this." Conrad opened the folder and began scanning through the pages. Area maps for the development site, lists of buildings set for demolition, detailed redevelopment plans, projected profits in the hundreds of millions. His eyes moved over each line, each number, each address. Then he stopped. One address in the list turned the blood in his veins to ice. Apartment building number 42. Elm Street, East District. Conrad stared at the line, reading it again and again, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He knew that address. It was where he had spent the last 3 days. The place where Jolene had saved his life. The place where Mason had drawn him into a family picture. Conrad kept reading, and each line felt like a blade driven deeper into his chest. 200 families to be displaced. Compensation set at 40% below market value. No real relocation plan. Only a small payment. Nowhere near enough for them to find another home in a city this expensive. He turned to the following pages. Coercive letters had already been sent to residents, threatening legal action if they refused the compensation and failed to leave on time. A community impact report had been manipulated to hide the true consequences of uprooting hundreds of poor families. Pierce had prepared everything, so the residents would have no real choice except to leave. All of it was technically legal, every form in order, every process properly followed, but morally ruthless in a way only the truly conscience-free could invent. Conrad looked out the car window, and Vegas drifted by beyond the glass like a river of light and color. How many projects like this had he approved over the past 15 years? How many families had lost their homes, their livelihoods, everything, because of his careless signature across a page? He had never thought about it, had never needed to think about it. The numbers on the paper had no faces, no stories, no pain. They were only tools for getting where he wanted to go. But this time was different. This time he knew the faces hidden inside those numbers. He knew Jolene woke at 5 a.m. to go to work. He knew Mason did his homework alone. He knew the smell of cheap coffee and soap in that tiny apartment. Mason's drawing was still tucked inside his jacket pocket, warm against him like a reminder of the very thing he was about to destroy. In the penthouse at the top of Ashford Holdings Tower, Pierce stood before a map of Vegas spread across the table, a phone pressed to his ear. His voice was cold and decisive. Conrad is alive. I know he's out there somewhere. The men I sent saw him. The voice on the other end came back low and slow. So what? He's wounded. He has no people, no resources. What can he do? Pierce ground his teeth, his eyes fixed on the city below. Never underestimate Conrad Ashford. Prepare a backup plan. If he shows up at the council meeting, I need him gone. Permanently this time. The call ended. Pierce slipped the phone into his pocket, his eyes as cold as the Vegas night beyond the glass. In the black sedan, Nina asked carefully, "What do you want to do now?" Pierce isn't going to let go easily. He's been preparing for this for a long time. Conrad closed the folder and placed it on the seat beside him. He sat in silence for a long while, staring through the window without truly seeing anything. In his mind, Mason's face rose before him, those clear green eyes, that clumsy drawing of 3 people standing in front of a small house. "You'll come back, won't you?" the boy had asked. And another question the boy had never spoken, but surely would, if he ever learned the truth. "Will you help me? Or will you take my home?" Conrad finally spoke, his voice low and final. "Cancel the Sunrise Project." Nina looked at him through the rearview mirror, unable to hide her surprise. "Pierce won't allow that. The council won't either. This project is worth hundreds of millions. No one wants to lose that kind of money." Conrad turned to look at Nina, and his eyes were sharp with steel, but there was something else in them now. "Then we'll take back control, and Pierce will pay for everything he's done." Nina held his gaze for a long moment in the mirror. She had worked for Conrad for 5 years. She had seen him angry. She had seen him cold. She had seen him ruthless. But she had never seen what was rising in his eyes now. Not just fury over betrayal. It was resolve for something else. Something she had never seen before in Conrad Ashford. At that same hour, Jolene returned to the apartment complex after her exhausting afternoon shift, just as she did every day. Her legs felt heavy as she stepped through the front entrance of the building, her old handbag slung over her shoulder, her nursing uniform wrinkled after 12 hours of work. She stopped at the mailbox on the ground floor and opened the small metal door with her worn key. Inside were a few advertisements and a thick white envelope. Her eyes stopped at the upper left corner, where a company logo had been embossed in gleaming gold ink. Ashford Holdings. Jolene tore open the envelope, pulled out the letter inside, and began to read an official notice. Apartment building number 42, Elm Street, had been designated part of the development zone for the Sunrise Development Project. Residents had 30 days to accept the compensation package and vacate the premises. The amount of compensation was printed clearly in the notice, a figure Jolene knew at once would not be enough to rent another apartment in this city for more than 3 months. If the residents refused, legal proceedings would begin to force the seizure. Jolene read it again, more slowly this time. Her eyes stopped at the company name printed in bold at the top of the page, Ashford Holdings. Then they moved to the smaller line beneath it, where the name of the company's chief executive officer was printed, Conrad Ashford. The paper trembled in her hand, but not from fear. It was from the fury rising out of the depths of her chest, spreading through her body like boiling water. Jolene understood everything. The man she had saved 3 nights before, the man who had lain on her sofa, eaten her food, let her stay awake through the night sewing his wound shut, the man who had listened while she told him about her family, her losses, the 8 years she had struggled to raise Mason. He was the very man preparing to throw her out into the street. He was the owner of the company that was about to destroy the only roof over her head and over her nephews. Had he known from the beginning? Or had he only found out later? Did it even matter? Either way, the result was the same. She had saved her own enemy. Jolene climbed the stairs like someone walking in a dream, still clutching the letter in her hand. She opened the apartment door, stepped inside, and stood in the middle of the small living room she had called home for so many years. Mason came running out of the bedroom, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Auntie, what's wrong? Your face is all white." Jolene didn't answer. Her hand still held the letter, her eyes fixed on nothing. How was she supposed to tell him they were about to lose their home? How could she explain that, once again, everything she had fought to build was about to collapse? Once again, she could do nothing to stop it. 3 knocks sounded at the door, gentle. Nothing like the violent pounding from the thugs the other day. Jolene walked to the door and opened it. Conrad stood there, on the threshold of her apartment. He had changed into a new suit. His hair was combed neatly back, and the helpless exhaustion of those past few days was gone. But there was something different in his eyes now. Tension, resolve, and something that looked very much like guilt. Jolene didn't say a word. She threw the letter into his face. Conrad caught it in one hand, looked down, and understood at once. His expression changed, his jaw tightening hard. "Jolene, I can explain." Jolene cut him off, her voice cold as ice. "Ashford Holdings, Conrad Ashford. All that time you were in my house. All that time." Jolene stepped forward, her finger pointing straight at his face, her fury finally breaking open. "You lay on my sofa. You ate the food I cooked. You let me stay awake all night stitching your wound. You let me tell you about my family, about my parents, about my little brother." Conrad stood still, not retreating a single step, not opening his mouth to defend himself. "And all that time, your company was planning to destroy this place? To throw Mason and me out into the street? To make us homeless?" Conrad spoke at last, his voice low. "I only found out today, when I reviewed the project files." Jolene laughed, and the sound was bitter enough to sting in the small apartment. "You only found out today? You're the chief executive officer of that company. Your name is signed on every document. You expect me to believe you don't know what you're signing?" Conrad didn't argue, because he knew she was right. Jolene went on, her voice trembling with rage. "Why did you come here? To apologize? Or do you want to pay me, like you offered before? Do you think everything in this world can be bought with money? Do you think throwing a pile of dollars at me makes everything go away?" She drew in a deep breath, trying to contain the storm rising inside her. "Do you know how long it took me to get this apartment? Do you know how many times Mason had to change schools before we finally became stable here? This is the only place that boy thinks of as home, the only place where he has good memories. And you were going to take that away from him." Conrad stood there, silent, taking the full force of her anger. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't blame Pierce or anyone else. Everything Jolene said was true. He had signed off on that project without caring about the details. He had allowed other people to deal with what were called human issues. He had lived in his own world, where people were only numbers on paper, where families were only obstacles to be cleared away so a project could move forward. This was the consequence of living that way, and now he had to face it. Conrad spoke, his voice deep and slow. "You have every right to hate me. I didn't come here asking for forgiveness." Jolene looked at him, her eyes red, but without a single tear falling. Conrad went on. "But I came here to tell you one thing. I will not let this project happen. I won't let it touch this apartment, and I won't let it touch you and Mason." Jolene looked at him and was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "I don't believe you. Not one word." Conrad nodded, accepting it. "You don't have to believe me. You only have to wait and see what I do." Jolene stepped back and gripped the door. "Get out of here, and this time, don't come back." Conrad looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away, down the stairs, disappearing from sight. Jolene closed the door, leaned her back against the old wood, then slowly slid down to the floor. Mason ran to her and dropped to his knees beside her, his small hands wrapping around her shoulders. "Auntie, what's wrong? Why did he leave? Are you okay?" Jolene didn't answer. She only pulled her nephew into her arms and held him tight, as though she were afraid of losing him. For the first time in many years, she didn't know what to do. She had trusted the wrong person. Once again, Conrad stood on the stairway, his back against the cold wall, his feet rooted to the old wooden floor as though they had been nailed there. He couldn't keep going, couldn't walk down the stairs, leave the building, and return to the car waiting in the alley below. Mason's drawing was still tucked inside his suit jacket, close against his chest, heavy as an invisible stone pressing down on his heart. He had faced enemies, faced gun barrels pointed straight at his face, faced betrayal from men he had once trusted. But the anger of the woman he had just left behind kept him from moving, not because of fear, because she was right. Every word she had spoken was true. He was the man destroying their home. Whether he had known or not known, whether he had meant to or not meant to, the result was the same. His signature was on that paper. His name stood at the top of that letter. The apartment door opened, the hinge giving a soft creak. Conrad lifted his head and saw Mason step out. The boy wasn't surprised to find him still standing there on the stairs, as though he had already known Conrad wouldn't leave right away. Mason closed the door quietly behind him, so he wouldn't make too much noise, then walked toward Conrad. He stopped a few steps away, His green eyes lifted to the man's face, and the bright innocence that had once lived there was no longer quite the same. Mason spoke, his voice small but clear. "Aunt Jolene is crying in the bedroom." Conrad looked at him and said nothing. Mason went on, his tone calm in a way that was almost frightening. "She never cries. I've lived with her since I was little. I've never seen her cry. Not when she's tired. Not when she's sad. Not even when she's worried out of her mind." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint sound of a ceiling fan drifting down from some nearby apartment. Mason looked straight into Conrad's eyes. "Is it because of you? Because of that letter?" Conrad asked, his voice rough. "Did you read the letter?" Mason shook his head. "No, but I saw her reading it. I saw her face change. I saw her look at that letter and then look at you. I saw your name on it." Conrad didn't know what to say. The boy continued, and there was no accusation in his voice, only the steady naming of a fact. "Ashford. Same as your name. Your company." He wasn't asking. He didn't need to ask. He was simply confirming what he had already understood. Mason looked directly into Conrad's eyes, and those green eyes were no longer completely innocent the way they had been a few days earlier. There was something older in them now. Something sadder. The look of a child who had seen too much loss, who had learned not to hope too much, who already knew that adults didn't always keep their promises. He drew in a breath and asked, his voice soft but every word clear, "You're going to take my home, aren't you?" Conrad opened his mouth. "It's not me." Mason didn't let him finish. "I don't understand a lot about the things grown-ups do, but I understand your name on that letter. I understand Aunt Jolene is crying. I understand we're about to lose our home." Mason took another breath, as though getting ready to say something very hard, something he had been thinking about ever since he saw his aunt sitting on the floor crying. "The other day you said you weren't promising anything. You said you weren't part of my family." His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes never left Conrad's for even a second. "But I only want to ask you one thing. Are you going to help me and Aunt Jolene, or are you going to take our home?" Conrad stood there, undone by a simple question from an 8-year-old boy. There was none of the complexity of business contracts here, no legal language, no vague clauses to hide behind. There were only two clear choices: help them or destroy them, black or white. There was no gray place for him to retreat into. Conrad had killed men, had betrayed others, had stepped over the bodies of former allies to build his empire. He had done cruel things without blinking, but standing in front of this child, beneath those clear green eyes waiting for an answer, he couldn't lie, couldn't offer polished empty words, couldn't turn away. Conrad lowered himself onto one knee on the old wooden floor until he was at the boy's eye level. He looked into Mason's green eyes like the mother who had promised to come back and never did, eyes that had already seen too much loss for an 8-year-old child. "I will help you." Mason didn't smile. He didn't brighten with joy. He didn't jump the way other children might when someone made them a promise. He only looked at Conrad, measuring him, as though deciding whether he should believe him or not. "Do you promise?" Conrad swallowed, his throat dry. "I promise." Mason still didn't smile. There was still no trace of happiness on his face. He said, in a calm voice so sorrowful it hurt to hear, "Grown-ups make promises and then they don't keep them. My mom promised she'd come back too. She never came back." Conrad looked at the boy and saw the hurt hidden beneath that unnatural calm, saw the child who had learned not to trust anyone, not to hope for anything, not to expect grown-ups to keep their word, just as Conrad himself once had, when he had been a different boy in a different life, before he became what he was now. "I know, but I still promise." Mason nodded slowly, as though filing that promise away somewhere deep in his mind. "If you don't keep it, I'll never forgive you." Conrad held the boy's gaze. "I know." Mason said nothing else. He turned, walked back to the apartment door, pushed it open, and stepped inside, closing it behind him, leaving Conrad alone on the stairway, in the darkness of late afternoon. Inside the apartment, Jolene had seen everything through the small window. She stood there with her back against the wall, looking down toward the stairway below. She saw Conrad kneel in front of Mason, saw the boy ask him something, saw Conrad nod. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw Conrad's face change, saw him kneel before an 8-year-old child, something she was certain he had never done for anyone in his life. For the first time, he looked like an ordinary human being, not a powerful boss, not a dangerous man, just a man confronting something greater than himself. Conrad rose to his feet and looked up toward the second-floor window. He couldn't see Jolene standing there in the shadows, but he knew she was watching. He knew she had seen. For the first time in 15 years, Conrad Ashford had made a promise. Not for his own gain, not because of business calculations or power plays, but because an 8-year-old boy had given him a chance he did not deserve to receive, and now he had to keep his word, or become the thing he hated most in this world, a man who broke a promise to a child. The next day, Ashford Holdings Tower rose beneath the Vegas sun, its glass facade catching the light like a colossal crystal. Conrad stepped through the revolving doors in a black suit, his back straight, his stride steady, as though he had never vanished from this place at all. The wound in his shoulder still throbbed beneath the cloth, but no one could see it. No one was allowed to see weakness in Conrad Ashford. The receptionist shot to her feet so fast her chair nearly tipped, her eyes widening as though she had just seen the dead return to life. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Conrad didn't stop. He didn't explain. He simply walked across the vast lobby of gleaming marble. Rumor moved faster than his footsteps. People whispered. Phones vibrated without pause. Messages flew from floor to floor. Conrad Ashford is alive. Conrad Ashford has come back. The security guards lining the corridor didn't dare stop him. They only lowered their heads as he passed. Office staff stepped aside, their eyes following him with open disbelief. The man everyone believed had died in an attack only days earlier was now walking straight toward the main boardroom as though nothing had happened at all. Inside the boardroom, the members of the council sat around the long oak table, while light from above spilled down in polished bands across the glossy wood. Pierce Lawson stood at the head of the table before a large screen displaying the map for Sunrise Development. He wore a gray suit, his hair combed neatly into place, and he was speaking with smooth confidence. With Conrad's tragic passing, I promise I will make sure the vision of this company endures. Sunrise will be the legacy we leave to this city. The boardroom door flew open. Conrad stepped inside. The entire room fell silent, as though someone had pressed mute on the world. Every eye swung toward the doorway, toward the man standing there. Pierce froze, the glass of water in his hand nearly slipping free, his face shifting in a flash from confidence to horror before he fought to smooth it back into composure. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. No one dared speak. Pierce was the first to find his voice. He forced a smile, but it sat on his face like strained wire. Conrad, you're alive. We've all been so worried about you. Conrad walked into the room, each footstep striking the floor like the knock of fate itself. I'm sure you were very worried. His voice was cold as ice, worried I'd come back. Pierce tried to let out a soft laugh, but it came out sounding more like a choke. You've misunderstood. I was only trying to keep things stable while... Conrad lifted a hand and cut him off. Sit down, Pierce. I have something to say to the council. Conrad moved to the head of the table, and Pierce had no choice but to step back and surrender the place of power he had so eagerly claimed. Nina Tran entered through a side door and handed Conrad the remote. The screen changed. The Sunrise presentation vanished, replaced by text messages, financial transfers, and recorded calls. Conrad turned to face the council, his voice deep and clear. Pierce Lawson sold information about my movements to the Reyes Familia. In return, he was promised control of the Southern Territory and the chance to take over the Ashford Syndicate. The council members looked at one another. One inhaled sharply. Another stared in open disbelief. Pierce stepped forward, his face red with fury, his voice climbing. This is slander. Manufactured evidence. You're trying to. Conrad cut across him, his tone still calm. 2 of your men already confessed everything. They were offered leniency in exchange for their testimony. Pierce went pale, his eyes darting toward the door as though calculating the distance to escape. Conrad took one step toward him. Don't even think about running. My men are standing at every exit. The oldest member of the council spoke at last, his voice grave. Conrad, these are extremely serious accusations. Conrad nodded. I know, and I have enough evidence to prove every word I've said. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. But that's not the only reason I'm here today. Conrad let the silence hold for a second, then continued. Sunrise Development is suspended, effective immediately. A murmur broke across the room. One council member stood, his face lined with alarm. "Conrad, that project is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We can't." Conrad looked at him. "I know the exact figure," another spoke up. "We've spent 2 years preparing for this project. Contracts, permits, every piece is already in place." Conrad nodded again. "I know. Then why cancel it?" Conrad was quiet for a moment, looking out through the wall of glass behind the boardroom where the city of Vegas spread below. Then he turned back, his voice slow but absolute. "Because I've read the real report, not the version Pierce altered and handed to the council. 200 families will be forced from their homes. The compensation is 40% below market value. There is no real relocation plan, only empty promises." He looked around the table once more. "We aren't building a shopping center. We're destroying a community." Pierce lunged a step closer, his eyes blazing. "That's how business works. How many projects like this have you signed already?" "Dozens. You never cared before." Conrad turned and looked at Pierce, his eyes colder than winter glass. "That's true. I did sign them, and that's my fault." He spoke slowly, each word distinct. "But today I stop. This project will not move forward." Pierce lost control completely. He moved right up to Conrad, his voice nearly breaking into a shout. "You've gone soft. What happened to you in those few days? You're not Conrad Ashford anymore." Conrad held his gaze and didn't retreat an inch. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not that man anymore. And that's not a bad thing." Conrad gave a small signal, and 2 large men entered the boardroom through the side door. "Pierce Lawson is stripped of all authority within this company, pending an internal investigation into charges of betrayal and conspiracy to commit murder." The 2 men took Pierce by either side and began leading him toward the door. But at the threshold he stopped, turned his head, and looked back at Conrad with hatred burning in his eyes. "You'll regret this, Conrad. You'll regret it." Conrad stood there looking at the man who had once been his right hand, his voice calm and steady. "I've regretted many things in my life, but not this. Not today." The door shut behind Pierce. Conrad remained standing alone before the silent council, their faces still stunned by everything that had just unfolded. He looked around the room and then said, his deep voice carrying to every corner, "Does anyone still have questions?" No one answered. Conrad gave a small nod. "Good. This meeting is over." After the meeting, Conrad sat alone in the office on the highest floor of Ashford Holdings Tower. The city of Vegas stretched below him, glittering beneath the afternoon sun like a blanket of diamonds. Unaware of what had just happened in this room, Conrad looked out through the glass, his eyes following the tiny cars moving along the distant streets, the small lives unfolding far below, none of them knowing that only hours earlier, a decision had been made that could change the fate of 200 families. Nina stepped in, a report folder in her hand, her face serious. She stopped in front of Conrad's desk and began to read. 2 members of the council have officially withdrawn their funding. 3 major partners are reconsidering their long-term contracts with us. Conrad nodded, not surprised. He had expected all of this. Nina continued. Canceling the Sunrise project will cost around $40 million in contract penalties and sunk costs, not counting the business opportunity we've lost. She paused for a second. And Pierce has allies in the Reyes familia. They won't let this go quietly. Conrad kept his eyes on the window, his voice calm. "I know." Nina watched him for a moment, hesitated, then asked, "May I ask you something? Why are you doing all this?" Conrad didn't answer right away. He was silent for a long while, his eyes still fixed on the city below. Then he spoke, his voice slow and measured. "In the last 3 days, someone saved my life. Not for money, not because they wanted a favor or expected anything from me." Nina waited, saying nothing. Conrad continued. "They saved me simply because it was the right thing to do. And I almost took away the only thing they had." Conrad stood, took Mason's drawing from the inside pocket of his jacket, and looked at it for a long moment. The tiny house with 3 people standing in front of the door. The word home scrawled crookedly above it. "I owe them. But this isn't a debt that can be repaid with money." Nina looked at the drawing in his hand and didn't ask anything more. She only nodded, as though she understood. A week later, life in the small apartment on the eastern outskirts of Vegas had returned to normal, but not entirely. Jolene still worked morning shifts and afternoon shifts, Mason still went to school and did his homework by himself when he got home, but something had changed. They had received a new notice from Ashford Holdings. The Sunrise Development project had been canceled indefinitely. No relocation, no compensation, no one would be thrown out into the street. They were allowed to stay. This tiny apartment was still their home. Jolene read the notice over and over, unable to understand why a multi-million-dollar company had suddenly changed its mind. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Relief, gratitude, or lingering anger toward the man who had almost taken everything from her. A knock sounded at the door, 3 soft taps. Jolene walked over and opened it, and Conrad was standing there. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive suits this time, only a plain white shirt and dark trousers. His hair wasn't combed into its usual perfect place, and a few strands had fallen across his forehead. He looked more ordinary, more approachable, less like a powerful boss, and more like an ordinary man. Jolene looked at him, her voice no longer sharp with rage the way it had been before, but not friendly either. "Why are you here?" Conrad stood there and was silent for a second. "I came too. Honestly, I don't even know why I came." Jolene looked at him, waiting. Conrad went on, his voice low. "The project has been canceled, permanently. You and Mason don't have to worry about losing your home anymore." Jolene gave a faint nod. "I know. I got the notice." Silence stretched between them. Jolene didn't invite him in, but she didn't slam the door in his face the way she had before either. She stood there, leaning against the doorframe, looking at the man before her. Then she spoke, her voice slow and deliberate. "You did the right thing, this time." Conrad nodded and said nothing. Jolene continued, "But that doesn't erase what you've done before, to other families, to people whose faces you never knew." Conrad looked at her, his voice low. "I know." Jolene went on, her eyes fixed directly on him. "I don't forgive you." Conrad nodded. "I didn't come here asking for forgiveness." Jolene tilted her head slightly. "Then what do you want?" Conrad was quiet for a moment, as if trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. Then he spoke, his voice softer. "I want to know if Mason is all right." Jolene looked at him with undisguised surprise. Conrad continued, "The boy asked me a question. I wanted him to know that I kept my promise." The sound of small, hurried footsteps came from inside the apartment. Mason appeared from the bedroom, his eyes lighting up when he saw Conrad at the door. "You really came back." He ran to the doorway, stood beside Jolene, and looked up at Conrad. Conrad knelt down, one knee touching the floor, bringing himself level with the boy's eyes just as he had done on the stairway a week before. "I kept my promise, Mason." Mason looked at him, his green eyes searching. "You're really not taking my home anymore?" Conrad shook his head. "No, never." Mason smiled. The first smile Conrad had seen from him since the day they met. It wasn't a broad grin. It wasn't laughter spilling out bright and loud. It was only the faint curve of a mouth, a little more light in his eyes. But it was real, a real smile. "I believe you." 3 simple words, and yet they carried more weight than any multi-million-dollar contract Conrad had ever signed. Jolene stood there, watching the two of them. She didn't smile, but her eyes were less cold now, less guarded than before. Conrad rose to his feet and gave her a slight nod. "I won't bother you again." He turned as if to leave. Jolene spoke. "Wait." Conrad stopped and turned back toward her. Jolene disappeared inside the apartment for a moment, then returned with a glass of water in her hand. She held it out to him. "Drink this before you go. It's hot today." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a welcome. It was only a glass of water, but Conrad understood what it meant. It was an acknowledgement that he had done the right thing, that he had kept his word, that maybe, only maybe, he wasn't quite as terrible as she had once believed. Conrad took the glass and drank slowly. The 3 of them stood in the doorway of the little apartment beneath the late Vegas sunlight. Not family, not friends, only people who had crossed through one another's lives by accident, and left behind marks that could never be erased. The glass of water was empty now, and Conrad set it down on the small table beside the door. No one spoke for a while. There was only the steady turning of the ceiling fan and the distant hum of traffic drifting up from the street below. The late Vegas sunlight spilled through the window, washing the little apartment in gold and laying a warm honey-colored glow over everything. All at once, Mason ran into the bedroom and disappeared for a moment. Then he came hurrying back out, holding 2 drawings in his hands. Wait a second. I have something I want to give you. Conrad paused in the doorway and turned to look at him. Mason held out the first drawing, the old one he had made while Conrad was staying there. The picture with 3 people standing in front of the little house. I drew this one when you were in our home. Conrad looked at the drawing and remembered the feeling of the first time the boy had handed it to him. Remembered the way his fingers had trembled just a little as he took that fragile sheet of paper. Then Mason held out the second drawing, a new one, the paper still carrying the faint smell of colored pencils. And I just drew this one yesterday. This is my home with Aunt Jolene. Conrad looked at the new picture. It was still the same little house, with lit windows, a red roof, and yellow walls. But this time there were only 2 people standing in front of the door, Jolene and Mason. Conrad wasn't in the drawing. Conrad studied it carefully, and he understood. This wasn't rejection. It was simply the truth. He didn't belong to their world. He wasn't part of their family. This tiny apartment, this simple life, this plain and honest love, was not a place meant for a man like him. And that was all right. Mason explained it in the innocent voice of a child stating the simplest fact in the world. I drew my home. You're not in my home, because you have your own world. Conrad nodded. He wasn't hurt. He simply accepted it. Then Mason handed him the old drawing, the one with all 3 of them. But this one is for you, because you don't have a home. You need it more than I do. Conrad stood completely still, his hand not yet lifted to take the picture. An 8-year-old child had just given him something he hadn't even known he needed. A simple drawing, made with colored pencils, rough lines, uneven colors. But inside that drawing, he had been placed into a place called home. He had been drawn standing beside other people as part of something warm, something he had never truly had in 15 years inside his cold and luxurious penthouse. Conrad took the drawing, and his hand trembled a little. Thank you, Mason. Mason nodded, as though giving a gift to a mafia boss were the most ordinary thing in the world. It's nothing. Just make sure you keep it safe. Jolene stood beside the doorway, watching the exchange between the 2 of them. Then she spoke, her voice softer than it had been before. What will you do after this? Conrad looked at her. Keep moving forward. Do what I need to do. Jolene asked again. The same old work? Conrad looked out through the window where the city of Vegas was beginning to light up as evening fell. Partly, but differently. Jolene tilted her head. Differently how? Conrad lowered his eyes to the drawing in his hand, the little house with 3 people standing in front of the door. I'll remember that behind the numbers on paper, there are real people looking back. There are children waiting. There are homes that somebody calls the one place where they belong. Conrad stepped out the door and went down the stairs. He didn't promise to come back. He didn't promise anything at all, because he had learned that a promise should only be made when a man knows he can keep it. Jolene and Mason stood in the doorway of the apartment, watching his figure grow smaller in the distance. Mason spoke softly to Jolene, his voice thoughtful. Do you think he'll become a good man? Jolene looked at her nephew and thought for a long while before answering. I don't know. Maybe not completely. Mason nodded to himself. But he kept his promise to me. Jolene nodded. Yes, he did keep his promise. Mason kept looking in the direction Conrad had gone, his voice light as breath. Then I don't think he's completely bad, Auntie. I think he's just lost, like the people in fairy tales who wander into the forest and can't find the way back out. Jolene looked down at her nephew, startled by a wisdom far beyond 8 years of age. The black car rolled through the streets of Vegas. Conrad sat in the back seat with Mason's drawing in his hands. Nina drove in silence, asking nothing, her attention fixed on the road ahead. Outside the windows, the neon lights were beginning to flare to life as darkness settled over the city, flickering in every color like the restless heartbeat of Vegas itself. Conrad looked at the drawing beneath the passing glow of streetlights. The little house, the 3 people. The word home scrawled above them in a child's unsteady hand. For 15 years he had built his empire with blood and darkness. He was still the head of the Ashford Syndicate, still dangerous, still surrounded by enemies waiting for weakness. Pierce would find a way to seek revenge. The Reyes familia would not forget this wound. His world had not changed simply because of one promise made to an 8-year-old boy. And yet something inside him had cracked. Not shattered completely, not vanished, just a small crack in the stone wall he had built around himself for so many years. And through that crack, a little light had entered. light from the green eyes of a child who had believed in him when no one else had. Conrad folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside the breast pocket of his shirt, directly over his heart. The car kept moving into the Vegas night, with neon lights pulsing on both sides of the road like the endless heartbeat of the city that never slept. Conrad didn't know what kind of man he would become after everything that had happened, but for the first time in 15 years, he wanted to try living differently. Not because anyone had forced him, not because of fear or calculation or profit, but because an 8-year-old boy had given him something that all the money in the world could never buy: a chance to be drawn into someone's picture, a chance to belong in a place called home. Even the deepest darkness has its cracks, and sometimes all it takes is one child asking the right question for the light to begin finding its way in. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the very end. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving stories we share each day. How did this story make you feel? What do you think about Conrad? About Jolene? About little Mason? We would truly love to read your comments from the deepest part of your heart, to hear your real feelings about this story. Every comment you leave is a precious source of encouragement that helps us keep creating more meaningful stories. We wish every person watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.